Hi everybody, welcome back to Honeysuckle Homestead Retreat. If you're new to my channel, my name is Desiree, and basically I live and work in Atlanta, but I have a tiny house up in the Appalachian Mountains where I'm slowly starting an off-grid farm. So today's video, I am actually going to talk about my land. I have received a few questions in the comments about how I went about getting my property, and so today I decided to answer those questions. Now, I bought this property about 4 years ago. I've always wanted to have land ever since I was a little girl, and having land is something that my family's always done. I just wanted to have a bunch of land, and I didn't really know what I was going to do with it initially. It was more of a place for me to go to and to get away from the city. I would camp out there because the land that I have when I bought it didn't have any kind of house on it. So it was more of a getaway spot for me initially, but I just knew that I wanted to go ahead and secure it. So about 4 years ago, I started searching on zillow.com. So I am a huge fan of Zillow. The great thing about it is you can highlight an area on the map and say, this is the area that I want to be in. And then you can put in all your parameters. Like for me, for example, I highlighted an area and then I put in that I wanted it to be at least 10 acres or more. I did not want it to have a house on it, so I chose raw land. I wanted it to have water of some sort, so either a river or a creek, a pond, a lake, or something like that. I definitely wanted it to have a water source. And I wanted it to be partially pasture land and then partially wooded land. And I also wanted to have at least a wooded mountainside. One whole mountain would have been awesome, but I was okay with a wooded mountainside, and I wanted it to be a usable mountainside. So I wanted to be able to hike it. I wanted it to have some areas that were somewhat level, basically a mountain that wasn't too steep. So these are the parameters that I put in. Of course, you can't put in all those parameters on Zillow. Like for example, I couldn't say, I don't want the mountain to be too steep. I could type in stream or water or pond or whatever, but I found that putting that in didn't really help my search results that well. So what I ended up doing is I just put in the area that I wanted to be in. I was looking for property that was $30,000 or less initially. The land I ended up getting was more than that, but we'll get to that later. So basically those were the only parameters I put in, that it would be 10 acres or more and $30,000 or less. And then I just looked at all the properties and I looked at pictures. I looked at aerial shots. The aerial shots were really important to me because I could see what was wooded and what was pasture. And then I was also able to look for creeks or rivers or ponds. And I looked at a lot of topography maps as well to kind of get an idea of the slope of the mountain. Now, I ended up finding a property that fit all of my parameters, every single one of them. And I decided to contact the listing agent for that property. Her name is Nicole. And I called her up and I'm like, I want to go look at this property. So we go look, and it did. It had everything. It was right on the river. It had some usable pasture. It only had about 2.5 to 3 acres of pasture. And then the rest of it was a wooded mountainside. It was 20 acres. And she informs me that that pasture area floods, guaranteed, every year. And if I were to build a house on it, it would have to be on stilts. And I'm like, don't know how I feel about that. That doesn't sound good to me. So I ended up turning that property down. Luckily, Nicole had 10 more properties for me to look at. And so we looked at 10 more properties over that span of a weekend. We looked at more that day and then some more the next day. And I hiked through a lot of properties. I went through brush, I came across snakes, I got ticks on me. It was wonderful and awful all at the same time. I did finally settle on a property that I liked, and it was really nice. It had a nice creek, it had a nice pasture area, it had a whole mountain that already had like a road built through it from the loggers. And I'm like, this is great. We ended up putting in an offer for it, only to find out that someone had beat me to it and an offer had already been put in and accepted. So I went home back to Atlanta after that weekend with nothing. And it was fine. You know, I'm like, well, I'll just keep looking. And then Nicole ended up sending me an email and she goes, take a look at this property. I know it's not in the price range that you want, but it just came back on the market. And the crazy thing was, I looked at these photos and I'm like, oh my goodness, I know this property. I had already driven by this property on a few different occasions. And I'm like, I remember that old barn. I remember the creek. I remember thinking, wow, what a cool little place that is. And it was for sale for $65,000, more of a loan than I was wanting to get. And I don't even know if I'll qualify for it. And so she gave me the contact information of a gentleman that was in the area at a bank, a local bank. And I figured it would be better for me to go with a local bank in this instance because, for one, it's raw land. It's harder to get a land loan than it is to get a loan for a house because you don't have the equity that's in the home. I think I had about $13,000 to put down that I had saved up. Some of it was in the bank. Some of it was saved in cash. I am in the cash industry. I am in the service and beverage industry, and I've been saving up this money and I kept it in cash. I had not put it in the bank. And when I went to fill out this loan application, and I'm like, I've got this money for the down payment, here it is, and he checked it. I did put it in the bank to give to him, but when he checked it, he said, where did this money come from? And I said, well, I had saved it. And he said, I can't accept that. And he said, well, we don't know where it came from. He meant, we don't know if you took out a loan just now and put that money in your checking account and it's not showing up on your credit report yet. Because if I had taken out a loan to pay a down payment, then that would affect how much money they were able to loan me. And I was like, well, it's not, I didn't take it out of, I didn't take another loan out, but I understand. And he said, it has to season in your bank account for at least 2 months before we can accept it. By then we'll know for sure that there was no other loan that came out. So I had to let that money sit there for 2 months, seasoning, before I could even complete this loan process. And I told Nicole this, and I said, I can't put an offer in on the property yet because I don't know if I can get a loan. And I had already fallen in love with the property. I had fallen in love with the property before she had even told me it was on the market. So, needless to say, I was on pins and needles for 2 months, hoping that the property wouldn't sell. And about 3 weeks before my time was up, my seasoning time was up, they started dropping the price of the property. It went from $65,000 down to $60,000. And then about a week before I was able to apply for the loan again, they dropped the price down to $55,000. It was a moment of, wow, this is awesome. And at the same time, please don't let anyone else try to buy this property from underneath me. I knew it was getting closer to the time where I could apply for the loan again. And I was just a few days away from it. And Nicole calls me up and she goes, I just wanted to let you know that they have received an offer on that property. Knowing that someone had already put an offer in, I decided to put an offer in for $1,000 more. So I offered them $56,000. I think I also offered to pay the closing cost. And then I held my breath for a couple of days. Nicole called me up and then I found out that they had accepted my offer. So I was excited. I was very excited, but I still was nervous because I hadn't fully been approved for this loan yet. And I really didn't know how it was gonna go. I went ahead and fully applied for the loan at this point in time and I got approved. And I'm like, okay, I'm getting this property. This is great. So there were some things that had to be done during that whole process. They had to send an appraiser out for the property to appraise it, even though there was no house there. That was pretty much it from what I remember that had to be done for the process of buying the land, because I didn't have any stipulations in there. You can have stipulations that you want to make sure that the land perks if you want to put a septic in. But my property actually already had a septic tank, which was a huge plus. You could also put a stipulation in that someone could go and test to see if a well can even be dug. I didn't put that stipulation in because the property already had a well. You know, like when you buy a house, you put in, well, if this is broke or that's broke, we can back out, or if this happens, I can back out. I didn't put anything in there saying that I was going to back out. So it moved pretty quickly. Now, closing day was also stressful. I found out that the people that owned it, the people that were selling it, weren't actually the ones on the deed. They had bought the property from a lady, a much older lady. I think she was in her 80s. And she was the one that owned it. And she was doing basically a owner financing deal with the current owners. And they still owed money on the property. So in order to close on this property, she needed to be there. She needed to sign. And that's fine, and she was okay with doing that. But the problem was, about a week before closing, I got a phone call from Nicole. And she goes, I have some bad news. And I said, what is it? She said, well, and I can't remember her name now, but she said, Mrs. So-and-so is in the hospital with double pneumonia. And I was like, oh no. One, that's awful for her, you know, that's terrible, especially at her age. But two, my question was, what happens if something were to happen to her? And Nicole informed me that if something bad were to happen to her, that the property would not be under contract anymore, and it would go to the family, and then they would decide what to do with it, which could be a good or bad thing. But the not knowing is what was stressful about it, because the family could decide to keep the property, or they could decide they don't want to sell it for that price. Anything could have happened. Luckily, she pulled through and nothing bad happened to her, so that's good for her and her family. But on the actual closing day, I am sitting there in the bank for hours waiting for her to show up. So she was riding with her son was driving her, and they couldn't remember which bank it was, and neither of them had a phone with them. And the only reason we found that out at the time while I was sitting there and they weren't there is the loan officer at the bank started calling around to the other banks in the area asking if they had seen someone, like an older lady, come in to sell property. And one of them had, and they said, yes, she's with her son. They're trying to find you guys. We didn't know where to send them. And so he started calling around to all the other banks, and he's like, listen, if a lady comes in with her son looking to sell her property, send her my way. And luckily, one of the banks did. They're like, oh, she's here right now. She just walked in. And so they directed her where to go. And the bank stayed open past closing time so that we could close on this property. And I was just, I was just so happy to finally have it in my hands. I didn't know what to do. I'm like, oh my goodness, this has been such a roller coaster of buying this property. It's been unbelievable. So a very much emotional roller coaster for me. But I was ecstatic once we all signed those papers and the property was now mine. It was a really good feeling. And yeah, that's the story of how I got my property. That's pretty much all of it in a nutshell. If you guys have any questions about buying property, please leave them in the comment section below. I'll answer to the best of my ability. I am not an expert in it, but I might be able to help you along the way. So, quick rundown of what my property has. It does have more than 10 acres. It's 21 acres. It does have the pasture that I was looking for. It does have the wooded mountainside, and it's a usable wooded mountainside. And like I said, it's got the creek. It even has a well, which was a plus, and it has a freshwater spring. That was also another plus. And then it has septic already, which was great. I wasn't asking for that, but it was a nice bonus to have it. So yeah, I'm very excited about that. And it has the old barn on it, which is cool, and I've been using that. It also has a cinder block shed on it that's 2-story, so I can use that for storage as well. And yeah, I'm super happy with my purchase, and it had everything that I wanted except for the price. But it all worked out in the end. It's okay. I did go over the $30,000 that I wanted to be at, that $30,000 target, and I did spend $56,000 instead, but it really did have absolutely everything that I wanted. And it has great neighbors. My neighbors are close by, but yeah, I still have areas where I can be a little more secluded if I want to be. So that's really great. Oh, and the property is unrestricted. So when I bought this property, I really didn't know what I was going to do with it initially, because this was about 4 years ago. I was thinking about tiny homes back then, but not as seriously as obviously I am now. And so for it to be unrestricted was a huge plus for me. But the thing is, there's a lot of property out in the country is unrestricted. You can get away with a lot more out in the country than you would if you were in like a tight-knit neighborhood. Keep that in mind. It's easier to be out in the country if you're going to have a tiny house, if you're going to live in a tiny house especially. Okay, well that's pretty much it. Thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. Please remember to hit that like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and subscribe and hit that notification bell to let you know whenever I have a new video out. And that's it. I will see you guys next time. Thanks.